All right, let's do this. Hey, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be on this month's action period call. I know everyone is busy, but greatly, as always, appreciate all of your efforts in this project and the time that you spend, not just on the action period calls, but everything you're doing for your patients and for this project overall. I'm Jamie Macklin. I'm the medical director of this project, and let's get started. Next slide. All right, as always, thank you to our supporters, the Ohio Department of Health, the Government Resource Center, the March of Dimes, and the Ohio chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics for their ongoing support for this project.
জি আমরা বাংলাদেশে 24 থেকে রাত 12টায় পৌঁছি।
If everyone could mute their mics, that would be swell. There we go. Right. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Here's our agenda for today. As always, we will have an intro Zoom poll. Evelyn Quarshie from the GRC will be going through our data. We're going to be discussing managing the culture of change today. Dr. Ronnie Christopher, who's one of the Ohio APQI consultants, is going to be giving actually a pre-recorded session on the topic. We'll have some discussion as time permits. Always happy to answer any questions. We'll then have a very brief QI corner, also pre-recorded on PDSA personalities, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are and who you might be, and then wrap things up. Next slide. All right, so our Zoom poll will be popping in momentarily. In the meantime, I know this has already been started, but if you haven't already, please put your name and practice in the chat for attendance purposes. And before or after you do that, you can take the poll. What is your PDSA personality? Are you a planner, a doer, a studier, an actor, or adjuster, or not really sure? Give everyone a little bit of time to submit. All right. By far, the most common answer was planner, and that's actually what I picked as well. Of course, there are no wrong answers here, but great. We will be talking a little bit more about that later on in this session, and maybe get you a second personality. At least talk about what goes into each one of those. So, next slide. All right, Evelyn, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. I think, were you going to do your own slides for this one?
Only for the measures part. So I have two other slides that I would like for you to advance the slides.
Very good. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evelyn Quarshie. I am a researcher with the Government Resource Center, and I'll be walking us through our data portion of the presentation today. On the slide that is showing is our data submissions update. So overall, we've had 4,426 submissions from 19 sites overall. And looking at that graph, you can see that we're seeing a steady decline in the number of submissions. I also wanted to call out that this is showing the submissions for a clean data. So once we process the data and clean it up, we do a tally of the good data that we have. So it's starting from the beginning of wave 1, which was February, to our current run, which is September. And over the course of the project to see a decline in the number of sites that are submitting data. So for September, we had 13 out of the 19 sites that have submitted data. And we are going to move on to looking at our data measures, and I'll share my screen for that portion.
You should have permission to share.
Okay. All right, can you all see my screen okay?
Evelyn, I can see it, but it looks like I'm looking at the wrong one. Maybe like your file explorer or something. Let me see.
Okay. Let me try
Yeah.
again. All right, do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So for today, we're going to be reviewing our measures where we're seeing a positive change over time, comparing the start of wave 2 to our current data run. And we will start off with a measure number 1, looking at the percent of women that are assessed for willingness to opt in to participate. We see a steady increase over time for this measure, starting off from about 94%, and that increased to about 96% in September. So not a huge increase, but just something worthwhile talking about. Our next measure is measure number 3, which looks at the percent of women that present positive for symptoms of postpartum depression and anxiety. This measure is showing a steady decline over time, which is good. We started off around 29%, and we are currently at 14%. So that's a really good decline in this measure. Next measure is measure number 6, looking at the percent of women that screen positive for tobacco use. This has also declined slightly, so not a really huge one. We started off from about 19%, and this has decreased to about 14%. The next one is measure number 8, looking at the percent of women expressing willingness to quit tobacco use. We can see some fluctuations over time for this measure, but overall, there's been an increase. So we started off at about 45% and currently at 55% by the end of September. Next measure is measure number 13, looking at the percent of women that received a referral or screening note for multivitamin use. This also shows some fluctuations over time, but comparing the start of wave 1 to our current data, we see a huge increase, starting off at about 5%, and then by the end of September, we had increased this to about 23%. The next measure is measure number 16, looking at the percent of women that report use of contraception. We see a steady increase over time. For this measure, we started off at about close to 40%, and we're now close to about 70%. So this is a really good increase as well. Next measure is measure number 17, looking at the percent of women who received the educational material. This is the on the Healthy Birth Spacing. Overall, there's also this is also showing a good increase, even though there's fluctuations here and there over time. We started off at about 76%, and we are currently close to 100%. So this is also showing a really good increase. And the last measure we're going to be looking at today is the measure number 19, which is the percent of women who receive the educational material, the Healthy Family handout. This also shows that we started off at about 88% and currently a little over 90%. So not a huge increase over here, but it's still cause for celebration. So just wanted to say kudos to all our sites for the good work that is being done. And I'll stop sharing. We would look at the last slide for some reminders. Next slide, please. So just some data reminders as usual. Data is due the 3rd of each month. If the 3rd happens to be a weekend, then the data will be due the following Monday. You can always submit data through 3 different ways, directly entering the data into RedCup, or you can fill out the paper form, scan that into RedCup and submit, or you could fax your paper form to Haley and she will submit on your behalf. If there are any questions related to data, they can be directed to Haley, Shadia, Ali, Jalal, or myself. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Evelyn. Next slide. All right. So we'll be talking here about managing the culture of change. Liz, was there audio on this? Hey, Liz.
Directly from Deming
Yes.
as well.
Okay.
So
I don't think we heard any of it before that.
Let me go back.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
So rule number 1 is really important. We need to remember that information is not transformation. Everybody wants data in healthcare and it's important, but we can get stuck there. It can cause analysis paralysis where we don't get momentum. We can't ideate on things we might need to test or action we might need to take. And just because we have data, it doesn't mean we know what to do with it. We have to really get innovative and think, what can we do that can make a change in the data that we see or that we have? We want to engage our providers around improvement, and our providers will also always ask us for the data, and that's important. And we want to be able to explain it to them, but we also want to be able to engage them on the changes that we're making at the operation level. They'll have insight that's important, but they'll also get a lot of insight about things they didn't understand that is important as well. When we're thinking about trying to transform, we should ask ourselves the question, what do we control? What don't we control? What do we need to control? And who do we need to bring into the change initiative? Do we need to involve patients? Do we need to involve referral sources? What does that look like when we're thinking about changing anything? And to think about this sort of culture change work that you can do when you're trying to make improvement, we can go back to Edward Deming. He's considered the godfather of improvement science, and he made this really famous quote that says, "A system will yield exactly what is intended to yield." So it's an important quote for us to ground on, because when we're asking people to change, we should ask if the culture supports it. Do we have things in place that'll help us get the change we're looking for? And these rules will help you think about that. One thing we can remember is that data is only a quarter of the change equation, and this comes directly from Deming as well. So he said we need to understand variation, because if we try to make a lot of change in an already widely varied system, we're not going to see the results. We need to get some stability and then start introducing new ideas so that we can see if our change initiative is taking shape. We need to have a good appreciation for a system. And we need to understand what parts of the system move what parts of our change initiative. We need to remember that the psychology and management of change is really a personal thing. Some people like it, some people don't. And we want to use techniques that help us level set so that all people can have a say in the change process, because when they do, they're more likely to sustain it. And that we need to apply the idea of theory of knowledge and action learning. This is where we can use the PDSA, or the Plan, Do, Study, Act test, to really help us gain momentum, starting small, failing fast, failing forward, and then learning over time before we implement. Let's look at system level thinking. This is really around the knowledge level sharing, if you will. In system level thinking, we're thinking about breaking down the different things we need to measure that help us with change initiatives. So we'll have macro measures we're measuring, which are the big, broad, large measures, the things we have to make improvement on a sweeping level. Those might be things like 30-day readmissions or all cause measures. They might include utilization measures at large, or look at a specific disease state. Something like outcomes financials or overall patient satisfaction for something. At the meso level, we're looking at the middle management space. Here, we're trying to understand, what departments or providers or different initiatives across our system have better outcomes than others, and what can we learn from them. And at the micro measures, this is where we really get the work done. These are the things we do daily and weekly. It's where we would do our PDSA cycles. We're engaging patients every day. We're trying something small, something once, something fast. We're learning from it, and then we're escalating it to more and more and more trials until we can implement something with confidence. At the end of the day, we're always going to go back to, what's the data telling us? What's the data telling us? And the one thing I want to leave you with on this rule is try to avoid making data red meat. What I mean by that is, data can become very beneficial and useful, and it can also become contentious. So we can argue about it, and we spend more time arguing about, is it right? Is it accurate? Is it this? Is it that? Instead of sort of asking ourselves a couple questions. We need to ask us, do we have the right data? Do we ask the right question? Did we create some theories and hunches about the changes we're going to make and what we'll see in the data, and how do we react to it? Are we shocked or surprised by it? If we plan to change that and the data would potentially cause harm, did we catch that and make sure that we didn't, cause any kind of undue harm to a patient or to ourselves by something that we tried to implement? And do we know the best practices, the evidence-based guidelines, or the real-world evidence that we need to apply to the data that we're seeing as a part of the new initiatives we're going to test in our PDSA cycles? So this rule is really about this quote, which just says, to do things differently, we must see things differently. And when we see things that we haven't noticed before, we can ask questions we didn't know to ask before. So I'll go back to, if we're too focused on the data and arguing about it, we won't be able to see things differently. So data is important. It grounds us. We want to make sure it's accurate, but at the same time, we also want to make sure we can continue to keep momentum and create interventions that we can test that will help us make change over time. So that brings us to rule number 2. If we're getting stuck, one of the things we can ask ourselves is, what's our role in the problem and what's our role in the solution? Sometimes our greatest personal strengths can be our greatest professional weaknesses. For example, if I'm super detail oriented and I'm very analytical, and it's a strength that people can rely on, especially when, we have to do some extensive analysis to maybe write a grant or think about a report we're putting out. It's amazing that I have that skill. At the same time, when we're trying to, iterate quickly, ideate, and think about making change over time, that might be a little bit of a weakness. I might be someone who gets stuck in analysis paralysis, and I need to rely on others who aren't as concerned about the things I might be to allow me to take a breath and step back and be engaged. So the things that we need to think about are, in terms of our role in the problem, can really be defined in the PDSA cycle. when you think about the Plan, Do, Study, Act, you can also think about applying these parts of a PDSA to your own personality type. You can ask yourself the question, am I a planner? And that's someone who really likes to know who's doing what by when. You may or may not need to participate in the activities. You just like to know, what is the plan, and do we have one, and who is it, and what is it? A doer, on the other hand, is somebody who would say, please just tell me what you want me to do. I'm happy to get the list. I will check it off when I can. That's my best day. They really just love to work on their list. A studier is someone who's going to say, hey, I can't do anything until I understand what the heck's going on here. Why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? Asks a lot of questions. And an actor is someone who is saying, come on, you guys, what is going on? Let's keep moving. Let's keep moving. So when you think about, your own personality type, think about where you land on this, this personality type profile for PDSAs, and then think about the people that you're working with. And ask yourself the question, do you have enough balance among your team to be able to create the culture that you need? You need a little bit of all these things to get momentum and move forward. If you don't have enough, you're going to fall short. And if you don't have enough, you need people to lean into the things that you need to fill. For example, sometimes actors can lean into planning a little bit, and sometimes doers can lean into acting a little bit. Sometimes studiers can lean into planners a little bit. So it's a good way for you to sort of level set and ask yourself the question, what role do we play as people in not getting ourselves the change we're looking for? Then that leads us to rule number 3. This rule is about filling the gaps. It's important for us to recognize that we are hardwired by who we are and how we're trained. Some of us are going to look for what's wrong first. Some of us are going to look for how to fix it. Let me give you an example. Providers have to be thoughtful about ruling things out. So they're looking for what's wrong and what's right, ruling things out. And nurses are trained to execute orders. They get things moving once an order is written. So you can think about providers and nurses and how they're trained, and how maybe a provider is looking for, what do I have to rule out and think about? And a nurse is looking for, let's get moving, let's execute the order. But if we don't have all the gaps filled in between the way we think, we might sometimes miss the boat. This is what we kind of call the Tetris effect, which is where we don't fill in the holes and we only see what we naturally think about. And so if we implement too quickly on something and we haven't thought about it, it might not sustain over time. If we spend too much time trying to focus on what's wrong, we might not ideate on something new and try something innovative. We can leverage each other's strengths, but we just want to make sure we're really aware of when our best training might also get in the way of our change efforts. Brings us to rule number 4. Best thing about improvement science is that it allows you to fail fast. We have a quote here from Michael Jordan who says, I failed over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. And I think arguably we can say he has succeeded really well. So the best thing about, PDSA cycles are they're intended to be fast. If you think about throwing a basketball at a hoop, that's a pretty quick endeavor. You either get it in or you don't, and you try again, and you keep trying and you keep trying. And so with a PDSA, when you start small and then you ramp up to more and more and more, by the time you are implementing that same cycle across multiple different people or interventions or visits or days, you should have a great degree of confidence that you can implement that without a lot of failure in the future. And so that's why we like to use this sort of improvement science, but you have to get comfortable failing. And for those of us who are studiers, we might be afraid to fail because in healthcare, failing could mean that we're hurting a patient, and we never, ever, ever, ever want to do that. So when we're changing or testing our change initiatives, being grounded in evidence, understanding real world practice, making sure that we are countermeasuring things so that we don't cause harm, all of those things are important, and they can help us make the changes we need over time. So that PDSA is really the way that we fail safe and we fail fast. And that's why we really encourage you to use it as part of your change initiative. Brings us to rule number 5. So rule number 5 is common sense is not common action. And the most easy way I can explain this is to say that what seems simple and easy to you may not seem that way to others. And so, you know, common sense for one person is not necessarily common sense for another person. Again, when we plan PDSAs and we let everybody give a theory in the plan phase of a PDSA or state a hunch, and we study and we, you know, go round robin and say, what did you think? Is it going to work, not work, etc. It allows us to level set and neutralize all of the differences we have among ourselves and come together more as a team. One of the things that you can do to really help kind of, you know, get started and make sure everybody's on the same page is think about this concept of the one thing. So in the one thing, what we try to recognize is that we can often have more problems than we have answers. And so to get us started on answers, instead of trying to fix everything at once or move to implementation too quickly, we can just say, let's start for one thing that we can do right now that can make a difference. One thing we can do today, not one thing next week, one thing today. It's the one thing right now. When we say the one thing right now, one thing today, one thing to try, one thing we can control, then we start to break down our ideas and the way that we think about things so that we can generate more ideas over time. It really is a nice way to help us get started. Another thing we can do here is think about how we decide how to decide. When we're engaging other people on decision making, determining upfront how we'll make decisions can be really helpful. It keeps people engaged when you're taking on a change initiative. So there are basically 4 ways to make decisions. Consensus is exactly that. Everybody has to agree before we make a decision. We probably don't use this that often because we don't have that much time. We're more likely to use majority, you know, the majority of us want things a certain way, so we'll move in that direction. But there's another way that you can make decisions, which is called consideration. This one is where consideration is saying, I am the decision maker. I'm going to ask for some opinions, but I'm letting you know upfront that I will make the final decision. So the difference here is if you ask somebody, what do you think we should do about something, but you've already made the decision in your mind and you leave that open-ended and they give you a piece of advice on, or they answer your question and you don't use it, you can disengage a person because they'll say, why'd you ask me anyway? We've all been in that scenario. But if you use the consideration method, what you say up front is, I have kind of made up my mind. I really think I know what I'm going to do and I am the decision maker here. I'm going to go ahead and get a couple pieces of information from all of you just to make sure there's nothing else I want to investigate. It's a totally different exchange with people. You know, people will give you information, but they're not expecting you to take it because you've already told them you may not. And that's really, really beneficial. The other thing that you can do is use the 10-second debate and collaborate rule. So in the 10-second rule, it's a little bit different than consideration. In 10-second rule, you can say, okay, I am going to be the decision maker, but I'm going to throw something out there and let everybody else debate about it. I'm going to observe and watch, and then I'm going to just go ahead and land on a particular decision. The key here, though, is to upfront tell people how you're making decisions and really help them understand where you're headed. And then that leads us to rule number 6, which is master my stories. Master my stories is a concept that comes out of the book Crucial Conversations, if you've ever read it. And the point of Master My Stories is to remind us that things never go the way we plan them in our head. It doesn't matter. Whatever you think, it probably is not the thing that's happening. So in Master My Stories, what we want to remind ourselves is to try to separate facts from stories. So we want to react to information without reacting on our emotions. But that doesn't mean we can't be emotional about something. It just means that we have to look and see, what's in front of us. And then we have to ask ourselves this question: what are all the possibilities of what I see happening? For example, if somebody is doing a PDSA cycle at a site and maybe, a colleague wasn't involved, maybe they were at a different, clinic the day before and they're coming in, they don't know the PDSA that you're doing, they haven't been involved with the planning of it, and you're testing something that seems awkward to them, the story in their head could be, what is going on here? Like, these people don't seem to have a clue about how to be organized. Instead, maybe if they ask the question and say, it seems like we're trying something new, I'm wondering, what's going on? Are we trying a PDSA? Then it doesn't create that strange sort of conflict when we act on stories in our head. So we really want to, think about it carefully and recognize that, whatever perceptions we have, they probably can be tested. And we owe it to ourselves to test them so that we don't act on stories and create conflict or make mistakes in change efforts. That leads us to rule number 7. So rule number 7 is about applying the soft side of sustainability to any change effort. What I mean by the soft side here are, interpersonal skills and theory building. It goes back to that idea of using knowledge in an actionable way. So the one thing that you can think about all the time with a change effort is in adult learning principles, we know it takes 8 different ways to get information for it to stick for someone. It's good to share it verbally, visually, tactfully, think about it in terms of email, text, notes, posters, but 8 ways before somebody really kind of lets whatever information you are sharing sink in. That's important. We want to incentivize behaviors that we want to see. When people are doing something that helps us continue to gain momentum in change efforts, we want to acknowledge that and incentivize it. And one of the best ways to do that is to say thank you and do it very specifically. So a thank you is always appreciated. A thank you for great work is very broad. A thank you for, I really appreciated yesterday when you did this because it gave me insight into that. And because of that, I feel like we're going to make a change. Really kind of as often as you can, saying thank you about the very specific behaviors that you want to see replicated. And celebrating success is really important. You don't want to do it too early. You want to make sure that if you're celebrating off of data, you know for sure that your data is sustainable before you celebrate too much. But you definitely need to celebrate your efforts when you're taking them. And that brings us to rule number 8, which is the idea of the hard side of sustainability. Now, sustainability here is more about measuring outcomes and process measures over time and making sure that we are, understanding what data we have, what data signals we're getting, and understanding when and where we're making changes that make improvement or decrease something in our data. You should have regular audit processes. So these, when you progress your change after audits, that's when you have an opportunity to step back and study the efforts that you've made and decide if you can continue to progress the work you're doing or if you really need to stop and level set something. We want to encourage and promote transparency, to really acknowledge when people are willing to say, yeah, I failed and I needed to think about it, or yeah, I'm willing to, share my progress over time so people can learn. That's super helpful in creating sustainability over time. And we want to apply regularly, rapid change methods like PDSA cycles. We can use things like failure modes effect analysis. We can think about how we're managing variation across our system, all of the things we learn in science. And then that brings us to rule number 9. Role clarity is always key in change initiatives. We want to know who's responsible and who's accountable. So what do I mean by this? So the responsible person is the person who is really leading the initiative. They're the person who is, taking it upon themselves to say, this is important. And the accountable people are those people who, take on different parts of a change initiative and say, okay, it's on me whether or not this works. I'm the person who is going to make sure and be accountable that we follow through and we do what we say we're going to do. So those two things are a little bit different, and we ask for accountability in healthcare all the time, but I'd argue that we need to think about responsibility too. If you don't feel responsible for something, you're never going to be accountable for it. So if you find yourself in your change initiative saying, well, that's not my responsibility, then you have to think about building responsibility first before you start putting accountability on people's plate. And then we can make the mistake, we can mistake the desire to study as resistance to change. So what I mean by that, when we talked about studiers, people can ask a lot of questions. And for those of us who, want to move a little quicker than that, or we get overwhelmed by questions, we can mistake that as a resistance to change. And really, maybe it's not that. This is where we have to master our stories and say, okay, if someone's asking me a lot of questions, it might not be they're resistant. It might be that they're just uncertain. It might be that they're concerned and they're trying to protect us from a mistake. What do I need to do to bring them to the fold and make them feel comfortable with the momentum that we're taking? One of the things I like to do with studiers is say, what are you worried about? Just ask them, what are you worried about? And often, we can step away from all the questions and they can say, well, I'm worried that, Then you can solve the problem with them. And it's a really effective way to make them feel comfortable. That brings us to rule number 10 and the most important of the rules. All of this effort that we make in healthcare is really to get better patient outcomes. And at the end of the day, patients are the masters of their own domain. And that includes all of us when we're patients too. We make our own decisions. And so we want to move away from labeling patients as non-compliant or non-adherent. It's really easy to say, if the patient just was. But if you think about this, answer this question in your mind. Have you ever not filled a prescription? Have you ever not taken a prescription the way you were supposed to? Have you ever been told or thought that maybe you should lose 10 pounds and you haven't? Have you ever, had an issue where you probably should have followed up with your doctor and you didn't? That might even be for the providers who are listening to this session. And if those things have ever once been true of you, you're also non-compliant and non-adherent. And if I said that out loud and you thought about it, it probably didn't land very well on you because nobody wants to be called that. And what we need to do is shift our thinking and say, patients make decisions, and sometimes they make decisions that are different than the decisions we're making for them. And so we need to ask them, help me understand the decision you made that was different than the advice I gave, and meet them where they are. Because when we ask the question instead of labeling them, we're going to learn how to engage them better. So 10 quick rules to help you with change efforts. We went all the way from what's happening at your site to what's happening between you all as people organizing toward change, and then what's happening with patients. I hope you enjoyed the session and really think about the things you're going to do to improve your change culture.
All right.
Perfect. I am trying to move the slide. My wheel is spinning here on my computer, so I'm trying to move us along here.
Guys, I'm sorry. I have no idea what just happened there. Anyway, we will probably be skipping the PDSA personality separate lecture because that was discussed in the recording we just listened to. Anyone have any questions or thoughts regarding what Ronnie Christopher just discussed? Anything that kind of hit you? Let's do a Zoom poll here, so see if that leads to any discussion. How confident are you that your practice is ready to support the changes you've made in this project after you've finished the project? So talking about sustaining, how confident are you? All right, couple more seconds. All right, somewhat confident. That's great. We'll take it. The goal, hopefully by the end of the collaborative here, early next year, is to move you all to very confident. But this is a great place to start. We will keep working on it. So thank you. All right, moving on. All right. And again, if you have any questions or thoughts on that, either drop them in the chat. You are welcome to unmute. But again, I think in the interest of time, we will move forward past the QI corner this week. Keep going. Keep going. We will try to hit on this at a later time when we have a little bit more time. So again, recognizing that it's nearly 1 o'clock and you all have patients to see, just some last minute reminders. Data submission for October data is due on November 3rd. I believe that is a Thursday. Next action period call is November 16th at 12:15. We will be discussing tobacco cessation, and we'll have someone from the Ohio Quit Line on to discuss their program and how they can help you make referrals and help your patients' families to quit smoking. If you've not already scheduled your next coaching call, please do so. The link is there. And then obviously you are welcome to reach out to Haley or me at any time for any resources as you need them. Any other questions, concerns, thoughts on anything that was discussed or you heard about today? If not, have a wonderful rest of the week. Again, thank you for all the work and all the time you spent in this project. We are grateful to you. Thank you.